post about Guantanamo Bay, about why Obama still hasn't shut down Guantanamo. Immediately, or across the blogosphere, things started to spread. Mehdi Hasan and Yo Zushi are the two Muslims and the New Statesman who campaigned for Islam. Yo was delighted to find out that he was a Muslim. He never knew it himself. But this is the kind of craziness, the paranoia, the fear, the hate, whatever you want to call it, just out of control. And those people who say, well, you know, you're exaggerating. Nowadays, the people who do the demonizing, they're very careful to say, oh, you Muslims, you've got a victim mentality. Victimhood. People listening to me would say, oh, well, you're just always complaining and whining. The interesting fact here is, despite all of this stuff that I mentioned, despite all the media coverage and all the newspaper coverage, etc., the British public themselves, according to an ICM poll in 2008, 2/3 of the British public believe that prejudice against Muslims has increased in Britain since 7/7. What's depressing is that other polls over the same period show that a majority of the public also tend to blame Islam for the 7/7 bombs. Islam, the religion as a whole. And again, I would argue that's partly, if not mainly, due to the skewed media coverage. Now, there are two responses often given by people to me when I bring up the media's role in this. One is to say, well, it's terrorism related. You can't blame journalists. Maybe you're a journalist. You have to cover the main stories, and the big stories are terrorism, national security, 9/11, 7/7, these are defining moments. How can you expect the media not to cover this? Of course not, and I agree with them. But the argument that this is all about terrorism and we're all getting too oversensitive and we're not accepting the reality that there are Muslim terrorists and therefore the media will cover terrorism trials, for example, the liquid bomb plot, for example, is nonsensical. I'll tell you why it's nonsensical. Two reasons. Number one, if all the negative press was just about terrorism, I'd buy it. But it's not. How do you explain all the cultural stuff? How do you explain all the stuff about us being different? I mentioned to you that Cardiff researchers found that 2/3 of stories identified Muslims as a source of threat or as a source of problems. Not just in the context of terrorism, but on cultural issues too. In 2008, the Cardiff University School of Journalism found that for the first time, the volume of stories focused on the cultural differences between Muslims and the rest of the British public, actually overtook the number of stories focused on terrorism and Muslims and Islam. I mentioned to you a moment ago, halal meat. How does that fit into the terrorism paradigm? If it's just a worry about terrorism, then why is the Mail on Sunday devoting 2 weeks running of investigations to halal meat? What, is the lamb chop going to blow you up? Why the kind of skewed priorities? Why the obsession with, for example, the face veil? And we'll come on to that in a moment. The other counter-argument is, if it's just about terrorism, and it's about Al-Qaeda, and it's about all of this stuff, then how do you expect the fact that a lot of this predated 9/11? This didn't just begin on September the 12th. The Sunday Telegraph infamously published a comment piece referring to Muslims as dogs with black hearts. That was before 2001. Cambridge University Professor John Casey wrote in the Daily Telegraph in August of 2001, a month before 9/11, anyone who writes about Islam in the press is likely to get a letter or two informing him of the worldwide Muslim conspiracy. Liberals and feminists denounce the position of women in the Muslim world, and it's quite acceptable to express vehement anti-Muslim sentiments in polite society without being accused of racism. Indeed, to disagree with these sentiments is to invite suspicion. No wonder Muslims feel misunderstood, denounced as blind male chauvinists at best, as terrorists at worst. The Runnymede Commission, which first coined the phrase Islamophobia, published its report in 1997, 4 years before the 9/11 attacks. Julie Burchill, columnist, provocateur, she wrote a piece, I remember very well, in The Guardian, not the Mail or the Express, in 2001, way before the 9/11 attacks, in which she compared Islam to, quote, bullshit. She said the Taliban represent ordinary Muslims in the UK, the hijab is a hideous mobile prison, and that Islam should be treated, I quote, differently from other major religions. That was in The Guardian, Julie Burchill, before 9/11, 9 years ago. And nothing's changed. Yesterday, in The Independent, Julie Burchill, in an article about Lauren Booth's conversion to Islam, described Islam only as a, quote, religion which supports the oppression, torment, and murder of thousands of Christians, homosexuals, and women worldwide. And she referred to Muslims as Jew haters. 9 years later. The other response that people come up with is that, well, you're exaggerating the role of the media. You're a journalist, you're bitter. But actually, most people don't care about the press. They don't get all the information. You're over-exaggerating the role of the media. The truth is, we live in a second-hand world. Most of us don't experience things firsthand. We get much of our information and our knowledge, our guidance, our experiences, our insights from various forms of media, whether it is a blog or a website, whether it's a book or a movie, whether it's a newspaper article or a TV documentary. It shapes our attitudes. The media imposes the parameters of discussion, the acceptable limits of debate. And you look around our country and you see the average person doesn't know a Muslim person, doesn't have a Muslim friend, has never been inside a Muslim home, has never visited a mosque. And so what they know about Islam tends to come from what they've read or seen on television. A YouGov poll in June, this is a classic, found that 60% of the British public say they don't know very much about Islam. Yet in the same poll, 58% of people said they associate Islam with extremism, and 70% said they believe Islam encourages the repression of women. Let me tell you this. If I was asked by a pollster from Luxembourg, would say, I don't know very much about Luxembourg. I then wouldn't pontificate about how Luxembourg treats its women, or whether Luxembourg's an extremist society, because I started from the premise that I don't know very much about it. But unfortunately, we live in a society where we say we don't know very much, but I've just seen something or heard something over there from that person or that columnist, that presenter, that politician, and therefore I'll base my view on that. And if we're going to understand or discuss demonization, then you cannot ignore the role of the media, of what I call the echo chamber. You look throughout history, and you look at the role the media has played in national tragedies, in demonizations on a mass scale. You look, for example, in pre-war Germany at the role that the media played in softening up society for the Holocaust, with, in particular, for example, those cartoons in Die Stürme of the Jews. You look, for example, recently in the 1990s in Rwanda, the role that radio stations, quote, hate radio played in building up hostility and animosity and hate towards the Tutsis. And you see the power. I'm not saying, let me just be very clear, I am not saying that the British press or the European press today is the equivalent of the Rwandan press in the 1990s or the German press in the 1930s. Nor am I saying we're on the verge of a Holocaust or a genocide against European Muslims. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is, don't discount the power, the role, the importance and the significance of journalists, of media organizations, of newspapers in shaping attitudes towards minority communities and playing a role in fanning the flames of hate, fear, demonization, whatever. Rabbi Pete Tobias of the North London Liberal Synagogue, he said that when he reads some of these stories in the tabloid press about British Muslims today, about them bringing disease into the country, being a threat, not living according to our standards, etc., he says, I can't help but be reminded of the Evening Standard and Daily Mail headlines in the 1920s, in the early years of the 20th century, about European Jews who were bringing disease, they were aliens. This was a language that was used then. And let's not forget, when we talk about genocide, by the way, the last genocide in Europe was not the Holocaust in World War II. It was, in fact, the murder of 10,000 Muslim men and boys in the mid-1990s in the middle of Bosnia, while European troops stood and watched. And you look across Europe, you want to talk about demonization, look across the continent. It's a deeply depressing picture. You look at the rise of the far right, you look at the spreading theories of Eurabia, that Europe's being taken over by Arabs and Muslims, even though every demographer at every university in the West says this is spurious nonsense. You look across Europe and see how political parties are using Islam as a way to get votes and bait Muslims. You look, for example, in Sweden, where the far-right party, the Sweden Democrats, just a few weeks ago, for the first time were elected to parliament, and their platform is centered around fear of Islam, around the, quote, creeping Islamification of Sweden. Sweden! In Sweden, the Muslim population makes up max 5% of the population. And yet the deputy leader of the Sweden Democrats says Sweden is on the verge of an Iranian-style Islamic revolution. That 95% of non-Muslim Swedes are actually overrun by the savage barbarian hordes. You look at France and Belgium, where they've gone ahead and banned the veil. The face veil. That's been the priority for politicians in these countries. France has spent the last few months